Congratulations on making it to medical school, which is undoubtedly one of the most exciting times in your life and potentially one of the most stressful times in your life. In this video, I offer my advice for making it through medical school in the healthiest, happiest, and most efficient way possible. Potentially the most controversial advice that I'd offer is actually the advice that I feel strongest about, which is to always prioritize doing things that you enjoy. That almost sounds ridiculous to say out loud, but once you start medical school and you see what clubs are available, volunteer opportunities, research opportunities, and so forth, it can be easy to think that you need to sign up for a certain number of things to make your application for residency look a certain way. And oftentimes that can mean boxing out the interests that you would otherwise have. But I would actually argue that if what you're thinking about long term is how your application for residency looks, then it would be more interesting to pursue unique opportunities that define who you are instead of the typical clubs and research that, say, applicants for anesthesiology pursue. Because any anesthesiology program director is going to read many applications for students who have rotated through anesthesiology or perhaps done some research, but they haven't seen something more unique that might be your own interests. A concrete example from my experience is that I got really into learning Spanish in the year before I started medical school. That continued for the first couple years of medical school, and I actually got so into learning Spanish that I decided I wanted to take off time to go immerse myself in a Spanish-speaking country. To make that financially feasible and logistically possible, I applied for a bunch of grant funding to go to Colombia in South America, where I pursued infectious diseases research, which is what I was interested in at the time. Don't get me wrong, I did do infectious diseases research while I was in Colombia, but make no mistake, my primary interest was in traveling, learning the language, getting to understand the culture better, and that year was absolutely worth it. Fast forward a couple years later when I was sitting down for residency interviews, and then I had the opportunity to talk about my experiences abroad, and even though I was applying for anesthesiology, I could still talk about the research that I did in infectious diseases, and then just more broadly, the kinds of experiences I had and how I grew as a person while I spent a year in Colombia. My take-home advice is that instead of building your interests and activities around shaping a resume that you think people want to see when you're applying for residency, start instead with your own interests and what you enjoy, and then see if you can somehow weave in your interests in medicine. And if not, that's fine too. When you're applying for residency, people don't expect that you live and breathe medicine. It's important to show that you have some kind of life outside of medicine, not to mention the happiness factor, where you're almost certainly going to get much more enjoyment out of pursuing interests that you're genuinely passionate about, instead of doing activities that are prescribed just to make a resume look better. My next piece of advice is fundamentally along the same lines, which is to prioritize your wellness as much as you possibly can. That might mean making time for going to the gym, going running, doing yoga, journaling, reading, whatever it is. This also sounds kind of silly to say out loud, but I promise you that the pressure you're going to experience to constantly be studying, getting ready for class, doing research, or whatever it is going to easily have the potential to crowd out anything that you would actually do for yourself. For me personally, this manifested as taking my study material to the gym with me if there was something that I absolutely had to study for and couldn't make extra time. So yes, I would be that person watching Sketchy Micro on the elliptical. And the other top way that I prioritized my own wellness in medical school was simply by making sure I got at least 7 hours of sleep every night, which did often mean that I was studying less than I wanted to, but if I was studying while I was tired, then it was basically pointless. So I made sure to get a full night of sleep as frequently as I could, even if that was at the expense of studying or doing something related to school. Next is mentorship. It's really important to try to establish mentors at multiple levels, starting with someone who's more senior to you in medical school, who might be able to provide advice for how to get through certain classes or what study material to use, all the way up to trying to get an attending physician to be your mentor if you're interested in research or a certain clinical pathway. It can be really helpful to have someone to talk to who can give you a sense of how to navigate that pathway. Oftentimes, asking someone to be a mentor can feel like a one-way street where eventually you're asking for recommendation letters and advice, but I promise you that the people who are willing to be mentors do so because they personally find it very rewarding, and you may find yourself helping them someday in the future, say with research or something similar. you're likely going to be overwhelmed by recommendations for study resources to get through medical school. That will range from textbook recommendations from your professors to third-party learning tools that are commonly used by second and third year medical students. I'll offer two pieces of advice to navigate this challenge. Number one is to stick with the smallest number of resources possible just to keep things simple. And the second piece of advice is to ask the senior medical students what they recommend, because they have gone through the testing experiences most recently, both for tests at medical school as well as national licensing exams. So they are going to be the most familiar with the most effective study resources that are available today. Keep in mind that study resources that are available can change pretty dramatically over time. So something that was useful to me when I was in medical school 10 years ago is probably not going to be useful for you right now. So the best advice is to talk to someone who's most familiar with the most recent resources. The one resource that is unlikely to change significantly over time is an intelligent spaced flashcard application called Anki, or Anki, whatever it is, A-N-K-I. There's a free desktop version and a paid mobile version, which is a little on the expensive side, but in my experience is worth every penny. In my experience, only a small minority of medical students don't like using Anki to study. It's not for everyone, but it is for most people. My observation over the years is that for better or for worse, it really matters who you know. Whether you're trying to secure a research position, apply for grant funding, get recommendation letters for residency, or basically anything else, it really matters who you know. I'm not suggesting that you try to take advantage of someone and use them as a connection, but what I am suggesting is that when you have opportunities to network with people, that you try and take advantage of those opportunities. And again, going back to building nice mentor-mentee relationships can be really helpful in this regard. If you are even remotely considering a competitive specialty, it is never too early to get started with research and clinical shadowing opportunities. Even if you end up changing your mind later about what you want to do, like I did, going from infectious diseases to emergency medicine to anesthesiology, having a research experience or a clinical shadowing experience in one specialty can still have crossover and be meaningful when you go into another specialty. And besides, any anesthesiology residency program director who's reviewing an application that has a couple years worth of infectious diseases research will understand that medical students get new experiences, change their mind, and then want to go into a different specialty. So that's not something that you should be concerned about. My point is, if you do want to do something competitive, it's much easier to start by doing research and getting experience in that more competitive specialty. And if you end up applying for it, that's great. You've already got the experience. And if you decide to switch to something else, then you've already got some clinical and research experience that you can talk about and that was hopefully meaningful to you. Even if the meaning that you got out of it was simply understanding that that wasn't the specialty that appealed to you and you were looking for something else in a different specialty. The whole concept of medical influencers, of which I'm certainly guilty, was basically born while I was a medical student. And over the years, I have watched some well-intentioned and some not so well-intentioned medical students get in trouble for the things that they post on social media. Not only do you need to make sure that you respect patient privacy and also any sort of hospital policies around filming and recording, which most hospitals do have policies, so make sure you check those if you are going to be doing any type of filming or recording. But in addition to that, many medical schools would argue that medical students represent the medical school even when they're not doing so in an official capacity. So if you post something on your social media account that's publicly available and your medical school sees that and has an issue with it, they may try to make an argument that you are representing, or in this case, misrepresenting the medical school. Also consider that it's very easy for patients to look you up. You'll certainly be wearing a name badge when you do your clinical rotation, so patients can easily look you up on LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever the social media du jour is. So make sure that whatever information patients can find about you is something that you're comfortable with your patients actually seeing. Just be cognizant of the fact that anything you post online can potentially be seen by your classmates, administrators, professors, and your patients. So make sure that the material you post is something you're comfortable with people seeing. I'm sorry to deliver this depressing news, but the reality is that depression is actually very prevalent amongst medical students. I bring this up to let you know that if you are going through a hard time in medical school, you are absolutely not alone. And the good news is that the vast majority of medical schools have mechanisms in place to be helpful for medical students. I'm not talking about wellness pizza parties, but I mean real resources like in-person talk therapy or access to other mental health professionals is something that most medical schools offer, and I would recommend having a very low threshold to engage with those services if you find yourself in a tough place. The amount of pressure that students are under in medical school can be excruciating, so it's really important to use every tool available to try and stay healthy under that pressure. There are a number of purchases that I believe are basically indispensable for any medical student, and the first one is actually right behind me, which is a second monitor. The number of different resources that you'll want to look at simultaneously is going to be best accommodated on a second screen, and these days they're pretty inexpensive and very easy to install, so just go ahead and buy one. It's very likely you're going to be spending extended periods of time in the library where it can be extremely helpful to have a pair of over-ear noise-canceling headphones so you don't hear anyone around you, and you can either listen to silence or your favorite study music. Getting a nice set of multicolored pens is also essential for most medical students. And I personally like the single pen that had multiple colors in it, but Muji pens are also very popular amongst medical students as well. And then later, when you're a resident, you can get a single color ballpoint pen and don't have to worry about the multiple colors anymore. Virtually all medical schools will ask you to get a stethoscope, and many medical schools engage in the shady practice of trying to sell you the Littman Cardiology 1 billion stethoscope for $1 zillion, when in reality, all you're going to need is just a basic stethoscope that you can get for less than $100. A very expensive and fancy stethoscope is not going to be useful for the majority of doctors, so just get something that's cheap and works, and if you need to replace it, it's not a big deal. My last piece of advice is to make your culinary life easier by buying either a slow cooker and or an air fryer. Basically, a slow cooker is for you if you want to just dump a bunch of ingredients into the pot and let it cook all day, and then when you come home, it's all ready to eat. Or an air fryer might be for you if you want to chop everything up, throw it in the air fryer, and it's ready 20 minutes later. Both of these are great options for the lazy cook, or in my case, I can't really cook that well anyways, so it just helps me make food that's edible and do so very easily. If you think I missed anything in this video or you disagree with my advice, let me know in the comments below so that people who are watching this video can get another perspective. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.